things at the same time. But obviously, I would prefer to look at you all rather than look at notes. So I'd just like to welcome everybody this afternoon. We have apologies from Paul Graham, Nicola Russell, Margaret Cook, Gordon Patterson and Claire Mailer. I don't know if there's any other apologies, Lee, that you've had up until this point.
None to me, Councillor Lyle, unless Danny has more.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Thanks, Councillor Lyle. We just had an apology from Councillor Parrott coming pretty late on. Okay. Okay, we have the note of the board meeting on the 10th of December. Is everyone content that that sort of reflection of the meeting? And are there, if you all are, then are there any matters arising that are not on the agenda this afternoon? No. So then come to the next item, which is the Local Outcomes Improvement Plan, the LOIP, and the annual performance report from that. And I would ask Lee if he will maybe present the update. And I'm unnecessarily brief because I don't have any notes, Lee, on it. Sorry.
No problem. I think Fiona wishes to say a few words first, Councillor Lyle. Okay.
Right. Apologies, Fiona.
No, that's fine, Councillor Lyle. I know how it is when you've only got the one screen. I just briefly to say, because Lee and David and many others have done all of the work on this, what we thought it would be helpful to do is just show you a couple of slides just to summarise, hopefully quite crisply, where we are with the development of the new LOIP. That's probably if we take it in that order, and then we'll come to the annual performance report. As we discussed at the Executive Officer Group last week, there's good progress with the LOIP, but obviously the devil's in the detail. And where we now need to focus our attention is on the action plan and how we will realise the ambition of the LOIP. I think also just to say, and again, we had some discussion about this at the Executive Officer Group last week, just some slight caveats and health warnings around the timescale for approving and signing off the LOIP. We've got an election year. We know that partners are themselves developing and updating various key strategic plans. The Perth and Kinross offer framework was approved within the council at the end of last year. The council is preparing a new corporate plan. So there are various different things that we won't get them all neatly lined up and stitched together necessarily, but most of those things do need to align. So we'll maybe come back to the question of final timescale for sign off. But Lee, could you just take us through work to date and what we need to do next, please?
Absolutely, Fiona, happy to do so. Apologies if I'm slurping on my Lemsip, but I have a cold which I've picked up off my youngest, and I can just begin to feel it at the back of my throat. So if I reach for my mug every now and again, that's the reason why. Yeah, as Fiona said, I've got a few slides here, so I shall share my screen and talk through them. Here we go. And of course, as you're aware, if you're presenting, sometimes you cannot see others on the call. So if anybody has a question, a burning question, please just shout, or we'll be able to discuss other questions at the end. So the current version of the revised Local Outcomes Improvement Plan has been shared with all the board members with the papers in advance of the meeting, and it's very much a working document. It continues to be updated, and we've got information that's coming over the last couple of days, and we're expecting more over the next couple of weeks, so we'll continue to adapt it as necessary. But there's maybe four key points to cover this afternoon. Firstly, a reminder of the statutory requirements associated with the Local Outcomes Improvement Plan. And secondly, an assessment of where we currently are, as Fiona's alluded to. Thirdly, a particular focus on the action plan, which is probably the most important part of the document itself, and then setting out some of our next steps when beyond the action plan, what we need to do thereafter. In terms of the statutory requirements, I mean, the way that we've approached this is that the LOIP is the Community Planning Partnership's overarching strategy for tackling inequality, and our kind of unique contribution to the P&K offer in terms of what we will do collectively. But technically it needs to do three things. It needs to demonstrate and evidence a clear understanding of the needs, the circumstances and the aspirations of communities in Perth and Kinross. Secondly, it needs to use the evidence that has been gathered to identify the strategic priorities and the desired outcomes that the community planning partnership wishes to focus on and achieve. And then thirdly, it needs to take all of that information and set out the actions and resources that partners will take and provide to deliver against the priority outcomes that we've identified. That was also worth quickly reflecting on the best value assurance report, excuse me, from 2019, as there was, as members will recall, part of the focus was on partnership working. And part of that highlighted these kind of key messages. Generally, partners working well together with strong and constructive relationships that go back a number of years. But there was a view that the community planning partnership could be more effective and have a greater impact on the outcomes that it wishes to achieve. There was a view that the board needs to take a stronger leadership role, and that was one of the first things that I think the board felt they wanted to do themselves when we started off this review process. And based on the initial LOIP that the Community Planning Partnership approved in 2017, the report found that there was limited evidence of the Community Planning Partnership having an impact on outcome improvement across Perth and Kinross. There was an argument that the communities across Perth and Kinross should be involved at an earlier stage of the action planning and delivery process. And the review of the Community Planning Partnership Board, the review of the Community Planning Partnership and the LOIP that the board had agreed to earlier in 2019 should consider all levels from the board right the way to the local action partnerships. So that's kind of the context of where we as a partnership kind of need to aim for in terms of the general improvement in the work that we're doing. But going back to the three kind of key things that the LOIP needs to do, first off, understanding the needs, circumstances and aspirations of Perth and Kinross. The LOIP reflects evidence from a number of different sources, as you can see that there. So statistical analysis of the impact of COVID from a variety of different sources, operational intelligence from individual partners around the table, the community impact assessments, which if you recall were a series of surveys that were completed by a number of community groups, kind of based on their views and experiences on the impact of COVID and the response to it. And lastly, some ward meetings, so a series of ward meetings that brought together community reps, elected members, senior council staff to discuss and try and better understand the issues resulting from COVID and lockdown across the diverse communities of Perth and Kinross. And this information is set out in sections A and B of the draft document. And there's still time to kind of change and amend that as necessary, but the general assessment is that we've kind of ticked that box and that bit's done. So secondly, then identifying the priorities and the desired outcomes based on the understanding that we have. In Perth and Kinross, a short life working group was set up, chaired by Gordon, who's on the call, in July of 2020, met across the summer to consider the information that I've alluded to in the previous slide and identify some emerging themes and issues. A fairly extensive list was then presented to the board in October in 2020, and following some additional work, that was kind of whittled down to the 5 priorities that we've agreed in December of 2020. And all this information is set out in sections A and C of the draft LOIP, and again a nice green tick to suggest that that's something that we're in our assessment is done. Thirdly then, to agree the actions and the resources necessary to deliver against the outcomes that we've identified. In order to do this collaboratively, the kind of steps we've gone through, as a bit of a reminder, we had an online conference in April 2021 where we had some topic experts setting out the existing work that was happening around each of the priorities that had been agreed, and those in attendance were asked to consider what else needs to be done and what the role of the Community Planning Partnership would be in seeking to deliver that. This was then followed up by a second short life working group, which was established in May, chaired by Claire Mailer. And they had a series of individual workshops focused on one of the priorities in turn, to kind of get into the detail a little bit more and to refine the information that had come out of the conference. And then latterly, the information from the conference and the workshops was used to begin drafting actions for the LOIP. And we've had a number of requests for input sent out to partners effectively since October, and some of that information is still coming in now. Initially, we were aiming for a 3-year focus for this LOIP, but following further conversation, as you'll remember, we agreed that given the circumstances we find ourselves in, we were happy to focus on 1 year as we're still moving out of the COVID and lockdown phases. So as the wee image at the bottom there suggests, some good work has happened, but we're not quite there yet. So in terms of the action plan itself, it's not completed. In short, we lack sufficient smart partnership actions to deliver the change that we want to see around the priorities that we have identified. A template has been kind of provided and sent round each of the partners to try and capture the necessary information for the action plan. And this covers the action that we want to take, the partners and services that should be involved, the resources that are needed in order to make the action actually happen on the ground, how the impact of that action will be assessed, and the timescale that we think is appropriate for delivering that action. And I've listed at the bottom there 3 areas where I think we're still a little bit light, and you can see them listed as fuel poverty, physical well-being and employability. So as much as we would welcome partners' views on all of the different priorities that have been identified, those 3 in particular we feel are a little bit light. Moving on then to next steps, there's a few things that we need to do in order to have the revised LOIP in place for summer of 2020, obviously caveated by what Fiona said with regards to elections, etc. So obviously completing the action plan with some smart actions, agreeing the performance management framework that the board will then use to monitor and challenge our progress in delivering the LOIP, agreeing a lead partner for each of the priorities to be that kind of critical friend, and then obtaining Community Planning Partnership Board approval for the LOIP, and we're aiming for the June board meeting if at all possible. And then of course the hard work starts thereafter in terms of delivering the actions and the ongoing performance monitoring, which may require, as was suggested in the best value report and as part of our earlier conversations as a board, some reworking of CPP governance and how we kind of deliver the work that we've indicated we want to take forward. So that's all of the slides. I'll come out of there so we can be in plenary and hopefully have a useful conversation about it all.
Thank you very much, Lee. I just as someone who doesn't do this as how do you say an occupation, but I'm interested in what you're saying in that the Community Planning Partnership hadn't really been able to demonstrate the impact that it had made. And just wondering where in item 3 there we agree a lead partner for each priority, that part of their remit should be to evidence the impact that the Community Planning Partnership has made in the priority that they're overseeing. And I wondered if that could be included.
Yes,
I'm
I think
asking Fiona.
Yeah. Yes, Councillor Lyle. It can, okay. And it should.
I think it would be appropriate because given the Audit Scotland report that we had several years ago, which reflected that weakness, I think, and given that that weakness has been identified as part of this as well, I think it would firm up and make us a more robust organisation if we were able to demonstrate and evidence the difference that we'd made. Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? No, I don't see any. Gordon?
Thank you, Chair. It's not a question, it's more, I guess, just an offer. You know, firstly, thank you, Lee, for taking us through that. That was a good, clear and fair summation, I think, of where we've got to. I see you highlighted one of the 3 things was employability. I think, Councillor Lyle, you make a good comment about having lead partners to push things on, but it's just a thought, and that is I don't think we've got Margaret here from the college or Veronica Lynch, as colleagues may know, is the chair of the local employability partnership. It's just an offer if it's helpful to try and move on maybe the employability element, as I'm quite happy to meet with Veronica as chair of the local employability partnership and see if we can work with Lee and David and Fiona to you know, tease out some actions that maybe aren't there at present. So it's just a thought and an offer.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very helpful, and I'm sure David is going to respond to that just now.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, just I suppose it's taking us back to where the genesis, if you like, of that idea was, and I think what board had suggested, and we felt was a good idea, with that kind of critical friend role. And pick it up, you know, to look at the themes that we have and the actions, and if you like, ask some of the so what questions and test some of that out. So, you know, for any board members who are you know, when we get to picking up the priorities and the actions, you know, don't feel like you have to be an expert, if you like, in that field. You know, it doesn't have to be Gordon and Margaret, for example, on employability, though there's obviously value in that, particularly while we are developing the actions. So it's just to remind board that's what that is referring to.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Councillor Barrett. Peter.
Thanks, Murray. I appreciate that the timescale is getting a bit tight, but I was looking at the food poverty actions on year 1 on page 33, and there's various mention of holiday hunger projects and voucher trials. Have we got anything in train to deal with the Easter school holidays this year? And would that timescale be too challenging if we haven't already, Sheena?
I'll ask Sheena to come in if she's picked up the question. I'm sure you did, Sheena. It's around school holidays and food poverty.
For Easter, every family who is entitled to a free school meal because of qualifying benefits will have that money paid directly to them.
Right.
And this Easter, the focus for ECS is study support in using the additional funds that we'll be getting from the Scottish Government. So families will be getting money for the Easter holidays and the summer holidays, Peter, paid directly to them, as we've done in the previous holiday periods during the pandemic.
Okay, that's really good, Sheena. I knew that there were, you know, some of the food share activists and volunteers were beginning to ask whether or not they were going to need to be doing, you know, holiday clubs that were kind of, you know, hunger driven as opposed to, you know, activity or study driven. So that's good. Thank you.
And it might be worthwhile, Chair, if I may, just updating the group in terms of the Scottish Government's intention for targeting funds for the summer period this year. So there'll be a much reduced sum of money coming to all local authorities. I think it'll be around about £10 million coming to local authorities. But the focus for summer is about providing childcare, actually, and again in a very targeted way. So we'll get the criteria of the kind of families that the money is intended to target and support, and we're currently in discussion with Scottish Government about how that will work. There is a carry forward of unspent funds, I think to about the tune of £22,000 that were previous budget motion monies that we've not used all of, and so the plan, Peter, would also be to use that £22,000 for some of the projects that we have done previously during the summer, and on that same, you know, basis of bidding in from the different groups. So information will come out in due course about that. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Sheena. Fiona?
Thanks, Councillor. I was just checking to see if there are any other questions on the LOIP and the process for developing the LOIP, because I wanted to just say something before we finish, and I can see Thomas has got his hand up just about timescales and next steps, and also the annual performance report, but maybe Thomas wants to come in first.
Thank you. Thomas?
Thanks, Councillor Lyle. I had the benefit of a meeting with colleagues and partners last week to go over this, so it was very helpful, and it set out our aspirations and the use of the LOIP in terms of tackling inequalities. One of the things, in picking up on Councillor Barrett's question, specifically around about page 33, 34 on food poverty actions, I have a question about how we track the changes in our investment levels across partners, and how we see that there is additionality or clear changes in patterns of behaviour within us as partners. Because if this is just a collection of identifying the resources that we currently spend or don't spend in certain areas by partners, then actually all it's doing is just telling us that we keep doing the things that we're keeping doing. So I think there's a question for me about how, as a collective, we demonstrate that how we are making investment decisions around about food poverty or any of the other outcomes is changing, Otherwise, this is just a collection of what we've constantly done. So I'd ask the officers go back if we can and look at how we monitor the levels of investment over periods in the past and moving forward, so that we can actually demonstrate some real change in behaviours and investment patterns.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a very good point, and reflects back to my point about where we see the impact that we're in and where we're able to evidence the impact. But Fiona, I'll ask you to respond to Thomas, and then maybe you could sum up for us.
Yeah, I'll sum up first, and within that I'll deal with Thomas's point, if I may, Councillor Lyle. So in terms of next steps, and thanks again, as David said, to Gordon for the offer to just move things a little bit along on the employability area, because that is, I think we can all agree, probably a pretty important priority within the new LOIP. We are looking for final input to this draft by the end of this month. We're very conscious that people have got a lot of other things to make and do, but I think, you know, Lee has very helpfully re-summarised for all of us that this has had a good long development phase. I'm conscious, and this goes back, I think, to Thomas's point, that there are other bits of the community planning architecture as well as the LOIP that will need refresh and review over the course of this year, including the governance, which was picked up in the best value audit, thinking about the local community planning delivery arrangements. At the moment, we have the local action partnerships, but we are piloting a new way of local decision making within the council in Kinross. We talked at the CPOG last week about our approach as a CPP board to strategic risk and how we hold ourselves to account for what is delivered or otherwise. And Thomas, I think on your question, you know, at the heart of that is joint resourcing, and also a shift away from business as usual. So the LOIP is not about what would be delivered as core business by partners. It's about the added value and how we pool resources, time, money, people, assets, skills to deliver the LOIP. And I think, to be candid, Thomas, there is still some work for us as a board and as a CPOG to do around those areas. So if we can get this draft to a point that everyone is comfortable, you know, within the next 3 to 4 weeks, and then start to attend to these other really important things around how we resource, how we track the impact of that resource, how we manage strategic risk in terms of delivering what we've all signed up to. I think that would be a really, really positive agenda for us over the course of this year. Okay.
Thank you very much, Fiona. I just wonder if anyone else wants to come in with any comments or observations at this time. I know Fiona summed up for us there very helpfully, but Sheena.
Thank you, Chair. And I put a Q in the chat, but I don't think you'd clocked that. Fiona, it was just following up on I think the question I raised the last time, and this is maybe covered in what you were saying about the further iteration of the report, the plan rather, and it was the current children, young people and families partnership, which sits as an ODG reporting to the Community Planning Board as was, is still in operation. So I guess I just wondered about, you know, the status of that and the other ODGs, and what the board's view on that is. And we'd also spoken about last time about key links to the workstream groups, for example, would be added to the document. Is that still something that will come out through the final iteration of this? Thanks.
Yeah, the key strategic links will be embedded within the final version of the document, Sheena. The outcome delivery groups, you're right, are an existing part of the governance for the CPP, and they've been around for a while. I think there's always, without diving into the detail of this because it's a whole other discussion, but I think there's always been maybe a wee bit of an imbalance between those outcome delivery groups and the children and young people's one is a really good example, which have a very clear statutory locus, and those outcome delivery groups which were more thematic and were a broader church, if you like. And that's why I say, I think in the round, the whole governance architecture probably needs a bit of a refresh and a relook, because it's 7 years now since we last refreshed it.
Okay. Thank you very much. If there are no further questions on that, I will move on to the next item, which is locality working. And David, are you going to introduce that for us?
Yes, thank you, Chair. We've got a couple of slides which I'll ask Lee to share in a moment. So yes, we had 2 locality workshops. Board will recall that Coupar, Angus and South Crieff were the areas that we agreed to have a look at, partly because the way the graphs were pointing in terms of some of the inequality issues there, and also there was no kind of existing locality based work taking place that for us to kind of bump into and perhaps confuse folk. So so we had one workshop in November in Coupar, Angus, and then we had that took place physically, and we went around the town, which was very useful. And then we had South Crieff, unfortunately, was a virtual one, aided by some photographs and a kind of virtual walk through the key assets and buildings within South Crieff. Attended both workshops, attended by a range of partners, and really what we were trying to do was have a bit of a deep dive, if you like, into that area and look into what were the inequality issues, what was driving those inequality issues, what was pushing those, and what were some of the local solutions that we felt would help address those. And this goes back to the CPP conference in April last year, where there was a strong desire for us to take a locality focus and look at new ways of working and look at how we could, as Fiona's articulated there, share resources, work differently, work alongside the community, make the best use of the data that we have, and try and make a bit of a dent in those sort of quite wicked issues. So if I could just ask Lee to put the slide up, and I'll just talk through some of that. Is that all right, Lee? About coming across all van tam in terms of next slide business. Okay, just move on. Thank you very much. Okay, so as you'd expect, we fairly similar issues emerged in each of the areas, but with a stronger local flavour, if you like. So, I mean, poverty, economic poverty underpins a lot of these, and it's important for us to remind ourselves that all these things are interrelated. People don't live their lives in silos. So, the employability, mental and physical well-being, the digital participation, all the things that we have in the LOIP, there is a strong crossover, and it's similar things that are driving them. But in each area, employment was seen as an issue, but the local flavour, if you like, around that. The question was, in South Crieff or in Crieff, the hydro's got 40 or 50 vacancies, job vacancies, and they're struggling to recruit people, and yet just off the main high street, we've got pockets there of unemployment. So is there a skills mismatch? Is it something? Is there barriers to employability there? Perhaps access to childcare, or is it working hours, conditions, etc., etc. So that was an interesting, little example there for the differences in the areas. As you'd expect, mental and physical well-being featured in both areas, and just concerns, I guess, in terms of the long-term impacts of COVID and lockdown. Both Coupar, Angus and Crieff have a number of buildings which are being used by a wide range of community groups, some if you like, are in better condition than others. But it was fairly clear, you know, walking around Coupar Angus and seeing the pictures that we saw for Crieff, that probably not sustainable. You know, single groups in buildings, not sharing resources, and looking for a future investment. So there needs to be a way of joining that up and having an honest conversation within those communities about how those, you know, we can make the most of the buildings and assets that are there. Access to support, so this came through quite strongly in terms of communities and families who were struggling, feeling that perhaps they were finding it difficult to engage with services. Within Coupar Angus, there was the suggestion of, could we have a kind of multi-agency roadshow, if you like, so people knew when they could have face-to-face contact with services who would visit the town. And a bit of a question in Crieff about, you know, were people aware of what support was available and was that accessible for them? And then, quite interestingly, we call it kind of community cohesion, and again, it was different in the areas. Coupar Angus, kind of from our worker in the area and the head teacher, it felt and seemed to be a community that was divided along a number of lines, whether that was sort of class, if you like, age, you know, how long you've been in, are you a newcomer, how long you've been in the town, and potentially ethnicity as well. And that made for quite a difficult working environment. In Crieff, slightly different in terms of lots of local community groups, very active, but if you like, all kind of a lot of them pointing in different directions. Some working around inequalities, others actually not engaging in that. So without, you know, we're not the community empowerment police. You know, we can't drive our tanks into these areas and say everybody must follow the plan, but there needs to be a way, you know, of actually trying to help those communities perhaps get sight of some of these issues and thinking about how we can work together to address some of these things to the benefit of all, whilst allowing groups to have their own individual remits and pieces of work. So quite interesting sort of digging into those. Lee? So what we're, you know, in terms of, I think this was raised at SIPIOG in terms of how is this going to look different and the ways of working. So we need to address, you know, the drivers of poverty, not just put a stick in plaster, if you like, on the symptoms that we see. We do need to get into actually the preventative work to ensure that people don't get into difficulties, and that's always a challenge in terms of getting upstream, if you like. But, you know, collaborative working, as we've said, whole family working, you know, working in a different way is one way, you know, potentially unlocking that, making sure that the community assets that are in those localities are managed and are run in a sustainable way, and we are making the best use of them and they meet needs of people in communities without having multiple buildings needing running repairs every few years, and ensuring that people have access to services. And some of that will be digital and online, some of that will be face to face, and it's getting that mix right and ensuring that people know how to access the services that they need at the right time. And then finally, community groups working collaboratively together to deliver the shared objectives, which will make, you know, Crieff and Coupar Angus better places to live for everyone, and sustainable and resilient communities. And sat within there, of course, is, you know, the role of the Perth and Kinross offer in that, and having those conversations with communities about their own aspirations and the role that they can play in addressing it. You know, this isn't just about services responding and you know, trying to fix the world, if you like. It is that co-production and working collaboratively alongside groups. So yeah, so that's a summary. You'll see the actions for that are in the draft LOIP, but we are going to kind of tease it out a little bit more and add a bit more detail in there in terms of some of the the richness, if you like, and the barriers that were highlighted in each area. So that's all from me.
Okay, thank you very much, David, and that's an extensive piece of work and a really useful piece of work. What it highlights to me is the challenges around that, and one of the barriers that I think is there that you highlighted with Crieff, and this has certainly been highlighted to me from the other perspective, where I have the owner of Crieff Hydro saying the locals don't want to work. Now, the challenge there is that in some cases, the locals don't see any benefit in work, if you like, because of the standard of living that they would maintain. But equally, I think there's a communication issue there between that we could maybe help between, for example, Crieff Hydro and some of the locals, so that they can understand the benefits of employment going forward. Where it's that, I think at the moment there is a disconnect there, and I'm not saying it's anyone in particular's fault, but I am aware that I've had on more than one occasion complaints from Crieff Hydro, to give that as an example, where they have found great difficulty employing local people, and a significant proportion of their workforce, which goes into 400 or 500 people, come from out with Crieff and out with the area, and it's something that would be, you know, as a focus, I think something we could try to address. I'll stop there, and if there's any questions for David, or anyone has any suggestions, given that I see Emma has her hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. It is really interesting to hear about that and Crieff Hydro's experience. I mean, employability and employment is so critical, and I mean, it's very difficult to get into here, but I suppose it'd be really useful to know as well what sort of contracts offer of employment is forthcoming, because that can be very variable as well. Anyway, that's not my point. The one I was going to focus on was about physical and mental health and well-being, and just to reflect in terms of services and thinking about health and both physical and mental health services, just how plugged in again the HSCP is around this. I know that Gordon Patterson gave his apologies for the meeting today, but is there anything that I can potentially help do in terms of connecting across to make sure the HSCP is connected into these discussions?
Okay, ask Fiona to respond to that, Emma, if there's...
Yes, I think that would be very welcome. I mean, some of the issues out in, again, without going into all of the detail of this, some of the issues around physical and mental well-being out in Coupar Angus in particular are things that I don't think have fallen on us from a clear blue sky, actually, just because we're doing this piece of work. I think they've probably been well rehearsed. You and I have spoken about them in the context of the Two Sisters outbreak, and they link in turn to some of the other key inequalities. So yeah, just to get a bit of continuity, given Gordon won't be around in the longer term, would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you. Thomas?
Thanks again, Councillor Lyle. Can I maybe just pick up on Emma's comments, but also on Councillor Lyle's comments, and specifically on the year one actions for Crieff, and I will comment specifically on Crieff because I wasn't involved in the Coupar Angus session, but I did sit in the Crieff session. I know there's a couple of actions there which are specific around about mapping. Within Crieff and by dint of that Coupar Angus, is there an expectation that there will be specific actions identified around about the 5 themes in terms of poverty, digital, employability, etc., over and above those very specific actions? That was my first question. And my second question, if I may, was that the series of actions, of 3 of the 4 are largely about mapping exercises. It felt from the session I attended that people have a reasonably strong kind of handle on what resources, what services there are in the area. Again, I think we need to be interested in what's going to change in terms of relationships and resources and how they are operating within the area, So I would certainly like to see something that tells us over a year, over 2 years, over 3 years, this is the things that need to change in terms of relationships and resources in a community such as Crieff. Because the benefit, the presentation that David did and Lee, was that it was evident there are resources that are sitting in Crieff. The question for us is about the sustainability of those resources, and the public pound will not be able to accommodate all the demands from all of those organisations and to maintain all of those resources.
Okay, thank you, David.
Yeah, I can answer. Yeah, I mean, you're right, Thomas. You know, the actions need to be addressing those inequality issues. I think where we got to with Crieff was a number of questions. So, you know, take the hydro and the employability. Is it, you know, we weren't certain what the disconnect was there. Was it a skills mismatch? Was it, as Councillor Lyle said, is it something about the terms and conditions? Is it something else? And so there was a number of queries and questions, and I think we probably need to speak to some partners and officers who were a bit closer on the ground and know a bit more detail, so actually we can refine the actions so they are addressing those things. I think the other thing in the mix for South Crieff in particular is that you know, Leader funded a community action plan for the area, which has had quite a bit of input, and you know, I think we need to have a look at that, because in many ways the community and groups have already contributed to a plan. We don't want to go in and feel like they're having to repeat all that. So having a look at that and what are the achievable things there, and using that maybe as a little bit as a vehicle for the honest conversations, as you say, about how we're managing assets, how we're working together, you know, actually how we're going to address some of these things over the next few years, as you say. So I think Fiona might want to add a bit to that.
Yeah, only briefly. I mean, on your first question, Thomas, will the work in each of these localities reflect the 5 new strategic objectives in the LOI? Not necessarily. It's about which of those 5 strategic objectives are most important in those localities, and actually, is there anything different? So those who are involved closely in Coupar Angus at the moment will know that we do have a very particular situation there, because one of the big community groups that's operated out there for a long time has recently got into difficulties. There are particular issues around building assets out in Coupar Angus, which are not unique, but there is an opportunity, I think, to try and work differently around the public estate and having a kind of one public estate in Coupar Angus, because there's a fundamental mismatch between the sorts of activities that the community wants to see, the buildings that are available, and what is actually sustainable in the long term. So speaking personally, I'm quite keen that we try and get under the skin of that and how we make that work better in a way that might be applicable in other localities. On your question about mapping, and I think David's covered this really, I mean, the words mapping exercise always make my heart sink a bit, because I think we can spend a lot of time just rehearsing things that we already know. So we're not looking for paralysis by analysis on this, nor the counsel of perfection. But I think, as David said, some local circumstances have changed, some partners have changed just in terms of the personalities and the people. So this is, as I understand it, David and Lee, just about quickly getting up to speed with what is actually already in train in relation to some of these issues. Where are the gaps? And what does that tell us about what we need to do next? Is that right? Yeah, it's the fauna and flora, if you like. Just what's the landscape, what's the lay of the land there, who are the key groups, who are the key players, and what's where they're working and who they're working with, and like you say, trying to identify where there's potential gaps and opportunities for closer working as well. Okay, thank you very much. And just before I bring in Gordon, I would say that your comment, Fiona, earlier about shared assets, and it's something that I think all members of this group need to be aware of, that there is opportunity for us to share assets going forward, and there will be a need, in my view, for us to share assets going forward. And I say this because it's to all our mutual benefit, not just to any one particular organisation.
And I think it's something that I wouldn't say reluctant, but we've certainly been hesitant at engaging in this process, and it's something that I think would greatly assist the evidence of the community planning partnership making a difference going forward if we did address it. Gordon. You're on mute, Gordon.
Oh, right, thank you, Chair. Yeah, so apologies, something I should have responded to probably a bit quicker. It was I want to come back to, if I may, one of the comments you made about Crieff Hydro, and it was just a kind of an afterthought. I would think probably, and Sheena may be able to help us out here as well, I would think developing young workforce will be doing some work, you know, in and around this both geographic area, but also sectoral area. And I just wondered if there's maybe something we can do to look at what they are doing there, and if there's anything further they can do, because that obviously gives that potential pipeline connection of talent that might help them. It's just a thought.
No, you're right, and absolutely, because I'm aware I've spoken to some young graduates from Perth College that work there, and also some that work at Gleneagles who would be their competitors in the staff demand, because they demand about 900 staff, whereas Crieff Hydro demand about 500 staff to make their operations work. Both of them have benefited from their training programs and graduate programs, and I've spoken to graduates who've come through Perth College and are really important members of their staff now, and have evolved through time. And it's just the question is how do we continue that engagement? How do we enhance that engagement going forward? Anyway, thank you very much. If there's any other points on that, if there aren't any, I don't see any hands up at the moment, I would move on to climate change. And I agree, the last board meeting, we would put climate change in as a part of our agenda. And Fiona, if you would like to introduce, because as I said, I'm not working on notes, I'm just working on bullet points that are noted before the meeting.
No problem, Councillor Lyle. I mean, this is an issue that board discussed in quite a lot of detail at the last meeting. So this is just a very brief update report. And there's two things in it, really. One is just a gentle reminder to partners. And once again, you know, we know everyone's got a lot to do, but we are still looking for nominations from some partners for the working group, which you agreed to set up at your last meeting. The second thing to just flag, I think, because climate change is a huge agenda, we all know that. Sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming in terms of both the scale of the challenge, but also the urgency around this agenda, which I know we all recognise. I'm mindful, however, that the key statutory role of the CPP, the thing that binds all the partners together around this particular table, is equality. So that's the statutory duty that sits collectively and individually on the CPP partners. So my proposal would be that once the working group is brought together, and I would hope that that could be fairly soon, that the first ask of it is for it to start sense checking the LOIP, or the climate change agenda, and making sure that that is well knitted in to the fabric of the LOIP, because what we don't want is a set of climate change actions which are just bolted on to the LOIP at the end of the process. Equally, you know, as we say with many other activities, it's not about just replicating business as usual, so things that each individual CPP partner will be doing in terms of your own climate change response. So the council approved, as this paper notes, our climate change strategy and action plan at the end of last year. So the CPP board is not here to police what individual partners are doing around the agenda. Again, it's the same thing that we've been talking about in other contexts earlier in this meeting. It is about what the CPP can do that only it can do by working collaboratively around the climate emergency. And there are some very specific equalities issues here. Fuel poverty is one, local food security is another, and there are more. So that was the purpose of the paper, Chair, but happy to take any questions on it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions and equally happy to take any nominations if there are any
Yes, I
coming
should have said
forward
that,
just now.
that too.
I think, yeah, I think it's something from my perspective that unfortunately I wasn't here at the last meeting, but at the last meeting it was indicated that we would seek nominations from partners, and I think that they have been in short supply, if that would be the kindest way of putting it. So it would be useful if we could maybe just focus on that as one of the outcomes of this meeting today, to try and get nominations in, possibly within the next week or two, so that we can progress with this item. And beyond that, I'm happy to take any questions from others or from anyone here. Obviously Emma is exempt from any comment from me, so apologies for that, Emma. But anyway, so that is where we are, and I'm looking for comments. Have we anything just now that we would like to comment with? And I am equally aware that we have shared some of our assets, going back to comments from Barbara Renton, because my chat's only starting to come up now. But I see we have a nomination as well from Jenny. Thank you. Do we have any comments from anyone else on this? I see one or two comments in the chat, but thank you for that. Emma.
Yeah, no, just to agree with Fiona's observations and reflections about making sure it's intertwined through the LOIP. I think that will be really, really critical, and it does permeate through so many areas. So I think that's really welcome. Thanks, Fiona.
And obviously fuel poverty is very topical today, given the weather that we have, and it is something that, given the crisis on fuel costs across the nation at the moment, it's something that we will have to address as best we can going forward. Okay, thank you. Emerging strategic issues I have. And Fiona, would you like to introduce that, or David? I'm not sure.
I think briefly we just put this on the agenda at the board's request, just enable any live issues or developing issues to be raised by CPP partners. One thing that I wanted to just check in on, Jenny, is I know that Laurie is wanting to bring something to the next board about emerging data and evidence around violence against women. Is that correct? I just want to check that's still on track, because if there is additional work or new things that the CPP needs to do in response to data and evidence around domestic violence and violence against women specifically, then just be good to get a heads up on that.
I will take that back to Fiona, to Laurie, Fiona. I'm not sure if you're aware, but she's off sick this week with COVID, which is actually why I'm here. So I've not been able to check with her ahead of the meeting, but I'll take that back to her when she's back at work and ask her to reach out.
Okay, thanks, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Lee.
Yes, thanks, Councillor. Excuse me, prior to the last SUPIOG meeting, Laurie and her counterparts in two other third sector groups, whose names escape me just now, apologies, confirmed that they would attend the next Executive Officer Group meeting to have that conversation in early April, and then the Executive Officer Group will determine themselves whether or not they feel it needs to come to board for any decision. So that one's in hand.
Okay.
Thank you, Lee. You know more about what's going on with us than I do.
Okay. Are there any other issues? And then if there are no other issues relating to that, is there any other business? And I see Jenny has her hand up. Jenny.
Thank you, Councillor. It's just a small question. It's maybe just a note for future discussions. I know that when we returned our thoughts around about the LOIP from PCAVs, the topic of a kind of an anti-racism strategy for Perth and Kinross was something that Laurie and Paul had raised. Feedback was that the LOIP might not be the most appropriate place for that, but obviously as the CPP, there may be another appropriate avenue for that. So I just wanted to raise it and give partners an opportunity to feedback whether we think that's something, maybe in the much longer term. I appreciate the LOIP is very much the priority at the moment, whether that's something we think we should be thinking about.
Okay, thank you for the question. And I'm looking at anyone else that answers that. And we have anything specific, more focused just now on racism issues. I don't see any hands going up. Jenny, I think what we'll do, oh, I see Charlene, sorry. My apologies, Charlene.
Thank you, Councillor. I suppose I could answer that from the equalities team perspective. In terms of anti-racism, Jenny, there's perhaps not an overarching programme in the way that you're suggesting, but I know that the equalities team are certainly always involved in particular areas and with particular communities working on that. We've been carrying out equalities conversations with different communities, both of geography and of interest in the area. So I'm more than happy to catch up with you if that would be of interest. I know that we were scheduled to have some catch-ups in terms of equalities with Paul and Laurie that haven't gone ahead over the past 6 months or so. But it would be good to catch up and just make each other aware of what's going on. And if there's a need for something more full going forward, then perhaps that's something that we can discuss between our equalities team and yourselves.
Absolutely, that would be great, Sharon. I think from Laurie and Paul's perspective, it was that partnership element. I think everyone has their own things in that regard. So it's the partnership element. So I'd welcome that conversation.
Great, thanks, Jenny.
Okay, thank you. Sheena, do you have a question?
That has just popped up. I think I put that in when we were discussing the first item, Councillor Lyle, and I didn't think it had popped up in the chat, so sorry.
Oh, well, no, you're fine. I was suspecting just popped up in mine, the way things have gone today. Anyway, I see there's a comment from Councillor Barrett. Peter.
Thanks, Murray. Certainly, there's been discussions at the Equality Strategic Forum about the need to develop some sort of hate crime awareness raising campaign throughout the community planning partnership, and there's been a number of working groups established by members of the forum, including Pink Salter, PCAVs, and our equalities team. Who are looking at, I think, various strands through, organisational development and awareness raising of, what actually is hate crime, refreshing the approach towards third-party reporting that the police are involved in, because I think that had suffered something of a hiatus. But I think there was also a kind of general feel that we needed to do something which got a message out to the public and was tied in with the kind of One Scotland campaign. So maybe it's just a case of pulling those strands together and bringing it to the Community Planning Partnership Board and seeing how we take it from there. Because I think ultimately somebody's going to have to cough up something in the region of £25,000 to get this to fly.
Okay, thank you very much for that, and I'm sure that will be taken on board, and it might well be an item for a future board meeting. Is there any other business from anyone this afternoon? I see no hands up, so I'd just like to thank you all for your attendance this afternoon. I think we've had a worthwhile discussion and meeting, and hopefully we will be able to receive the nominations required in due course, and I look forward to the next meeting. So thank you all very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you.
Have a nice weekend, folks. Bye-bye.
Bye.